called Hooray for Hip Flexion. We're going to be adding a lot of hip flexion into the movements we're doing today. So hip flexion is the ability to move just the hip without anything in the spine or pelvis moving. So the hips can extend, which is when the hips move backwards, and the hips flex when the torso comes toward the thigh or thigh toward the torso. We're going to get started on our backs. And before we come into bridge pose, we'll start with some hip flexion here. So as you come onto your back, take a moment to set up so that the back of your skull is on the mat, your shoulder blades and your sacrum, making sure we've got a neutral spine. So we'll hold the sacrum down, meaning we're not going to let the low back lift up and the back arch. So hold the sacrum, which is right above the tailbone, on the mat, and just alternate picking up one foot at a time without moving anything else. So if you'd like, you can take your fingers and put them into your hip creases and really feel the movement from the hips. So the thigh is coming any amount toward the torso without any movement happening along the upper back, the head, the lower back. So nothing in that triple S, skull, scapula, or sacrum moves, but we're alternating our hip flexion. So the right hip flexes as the right thigh comes toward the torso, and the left hip flexes as the left thigh comes toward the torso. Pause with both feet down, and we'll get ready for bridge pose, pressing into the feet. Imagine your tailbone curling up toward the ceiling. Now right away, squeeze your glutes. Lots of activity in the glutes as we lift into a very low bridge. So we're not going to be lifting the pelvis way up. We're just almost hovering the glutes off the ground, keeping the shoulder blades down on the mat. And again, hands can come to your hip creases, which is right where your thigh bone or your femur meets the hip. And if you feel like you could add that same hip flexion here in bridge pose, you can try to flex one hip at a time. This will be quite a bit more challenging to do holding that neutral pelvis. So maybe the foot lifts off maybe half an inch. The thigh does not have to come all the way toward the torso. We want to make sure that as we're doing this, the pelvis isn't moving side to side, it's not tipping forward and back, and the movement is just coming from the hips. Bring both feet down if you are flexing. If you're still in bridge pose, hold that strength in the glutes. We're going to segmentally lower the upper back, middle back, lower back, and sacrum all the way down. Interlace your hands behind your head. Draw your elbows in towards your face. Now take a triple S check here. Sacrum right above the tailbone is down, shoulder blades. And the back of the skull has the hands behind it on the ground. Big inhale here. Keep your sacrum pressing into the ground as you exhale. Lift up off your shoulder blades. Now really think about leaning your head back into your hands without lowering back onto the shoulder blades. Look at those two pelvic points. Try to draw them in toward each other. Inhale to lower. Exhale out as you lift up off your shoulder blades. Chin towards your throat so the neck is in a neutral position. Draw those pelvic points in. Now imagine knitting your front ribs in so that they don't flare or pop. Inhale to lower. Exhale as you lift. Chin towards your throat. Now look at where your belly button is, and imagine your belly button drawing down toward the ground. Reach your right arm as if you were about to reach it through your legs, and then reach as much as you can, keeping the shoulder blades on the mat. Hand comes back behind the head. Inhale to lower. Exhale as you lift. Chin towards your throat. Knit those front ribs in. Pull the belly button down. Left arm reaches between the legs. Reach a little bit higher. Keep knitting those front ribs in. Hand comes back behind the head. Inhale to lower. Exhale as you lift. Chin toward the throat. Draw those pelvic points in. Make sure the sacrum is down. Right arm reaches between the legs. Reach even higher, but keep the shoulder blades on the mat. Pull the belly button down. Hand comes back behind the head. Inhale to lower. Last time, exhale, lift up. Chin toward the throat, knit those front ribs in. Pull the belly button down as you reach the left arm through the legs. Reach, 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 but keep pulling that belly button down. Hand comes back behind the head. Inhale to lower. Make your way onto quadruped, coming onto hands and knees. We'll line up the shoulders right over the wrist creases. Knees will come right under the hips. Now we want to find that same neutral spine or triple S here by lifting the front of the throat up. So when we lift the throat, we're not lifting the chin forward. That wouldn't be a neutral neck. So you want to keep the chin toward the throat, but imagine lifting the front of your throat up toward the ceiling. Check in with that neutral scapula. We don't want to be protracting the shoulder blades here. We want them settled on the back of the ribs, and we don't want to be tipping the pelvis. So think about, just like bridge pose, drawing those two pelvic points in, lifting the pubic bone to the belly button. Hold everything really strong and slide your left toes back. Squeeze that left glute and keep lifting the pubic bone to the belly. We're going to lift up the leg, but not too high. We don't want the pelvis to tip, so keep everything the same. Bend your left knee, and we're going to flex our left hip, trying to bring that left thigh any amount toward the torso like we did on our back, and then extend it back out. So you can keep it bent as it extends out if you'd like. Flex that left hip, thigh toward the torso without any movement happening in the back, the head, the pelvis. Extend it back out. Two more. Flex that left hip. Try to bring the thigh toward the torso without the spine changing or the pelvis changing. Extend it back out. Press evenly into both hands. Flex that left hip. Bring the thigh toward the torso. Good. Release that left knee down. Switching sides. Check in with everything being in that strong neutral position. Head and neck, shoulder blades, pelvis. Slide the right toes back. Firm that right glute. Without anything changing, barely lift those right toes up. And we'll bend the knee, flex the right hip, thigh toward the torso without any rounding in the upper back or lower back. Extend it back out. Keep lifting the front of the throat. Flex the right hip, thigh toward the torso without anything changing. Extend it back out. Two more times. Hold that neutral pelvis as you flex the right hip, thigh toward the torso. Extend it up. One more time. Flex that right hip. Extend it back out. Release it down. Heading into downward dog. We're going to slowly lift up. Tuck the toes. Now as you lift up, think about your pelvis lifting straight up toward the ceiling. And really bend the knees so that you could imagine the torso staying close to the thigh. So we want that hip flexion in downward dog. So as you tuck your toes and slowly begin to lift up, think about your torso staying as close to your thighs as you can, keeping the hips in this flexed position as you head to downward dog. So maybe we walk the feet a good amount closer. Maybe we really bend the knees. We want to be able to lift up our hip creases right where our thigh bone, our femur meets the hip. So right in that same area we might have put our hands in bridge pose. Lift those hip creases up without tipping the pelvis. So we don't want to arch the back here or tip the tailbone up toward the sky. We want that neutral pelvis, drawing those two pelvic points in, lifting the pubic bone toward the belly button. Really imagine this torso to thigh connection. They obviously won't be touching, but we want the hips in this flexed position, so that torso to thigh. And we're going to keep this torso to thigh connection as we walk the hands back. So really bend the knees, move slowly so that you can keep the hips flexed and keep that long spine. So we don't want to round anything. Maybe we lift up onto the fingertips, maybe hands are at the shins, the knees, the thighs, but we want to imagine a broom behind our back. Would it touch the back of our skull, our shoulder blades, and our sacrum? So we don't want to collapse here in this happy squat. We're really flexing the hips. Our torso is toward the thigh. Our knees are flexed and our ankles are flexed. Our glutes are really active. And we'll keep this triple S aligned, skull, scapula, and sacrum, as we lift into a standing position, holding that nice posture. As you're standing, stack your head right over your shoulders, over your pelvis. Keep that stacking of your triple S as you walk to the front of the mat, checking in with our mountain pose, making sure that our pelvic bowl is upright. It's not tipping forward, we're not arching the back, it's not tipping backwards. And we're going to practice our hip hinge, which is another functional way we can practice that action of hip flexion. So we're going to take our fingers and find those hip creases again, right where our thigh bone meets the femur. We're going to inhale here. As you exhale, really press your fingers into your hip creases and move your hips backwards. So our fingers are helping that brain-body connection of hinging at the hips, flexing at the hips, so our hips move backwards. Our torso is getting closer toward the thigh without compensating our posture. So we're not going to round, we're not going to let the knees come forward. We're going to hold that feeling of the broom behind our back and hinge. Our hips move backwards so our knees stay right over our ankles. And then you're going to press into your feet, squeeze your glutes to lift back up to that same position. Again, without any rounding. So we want to keep that feeling of our triple S being stacked so that that doesn't go away as soon as we bend the knees or move the hips. So we keep that posture. Inhale. Exhale, fingers press your hips back. So really get into those hip creases. Move the hips back, back, back. Make sure we haven't collapsed anything here. Use your glutes to press into the feet. Keep that triple S stacked as you get back up. One more. Inhale here. Exhale, fingers to the hip creases. Move your hips back, 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 making sure the knees are over the ankles. Keep that feeling of the broom behind your back. Use your glutes to get back up. Now we're going to move into a little bit more of a flow with that goal of flexing the hips, keeping the torso toward the thigh. Reach your arms forward and up. Glide your shoulder blades up, but knit those front ribs in. Exhale, we're doing that same hip hinge here, but now we don't have the fingers in the hip creases. It's the same movement. Hips move back, torso comes toward the thigh, so we're flexing. Keep hinging, 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 and really bend the knees to get your hands down. Step to your plank. Knees can be up or down in plank. We want the shoulders right over the wrist. Now, just like when we were in quadruped, think about everything being in that strong neutral position, starting with the head. So we don't want to let the head drop, but we don't want to look forward with the chin forward. So we want to keep the chin toward the throat, lift the front of the throat, draw those pelvic points in, zipper the pubic bone up as you squeeze the glutes. Lower your knees. You can untuck the toes. Keep that lifting feeling. So here we don't want to drop anything forward. We want to keep that feeling of the broom behind our back. As we exhale, lower with control. Make sure the pelvis doesn't tip forward, dropping first. Keep the head of your arm bones lifted away from the ground. Chin toward the throat. Press your pubic bone down. That will help keep the pelvis neutral. And then imagine lifting your belly button up as you press the pubic bone down. Squeeze your glutes. Imagine your palms sliding back as we come into this low, low cobra. Keep that lift in the low belly. Lift to your quadruped. Back to hands and knees. Our right foot will step through. You can leave the left toes untucked, or you can tuck them if that feels good. Lifting for low lunge. We're going to start with our hands at the front and back of the rib cage. Imagining that broom behind the back. So notice if anything feels out of that triple S alignment, head stacked over the shoulders, over the pelvis. Now we're going to do that same action of hip flexion. We've done it in a lot of ways, but flexing the hip would look like the torso coming to the thigh or thigh toward the torso. So keeping our right knee where it is, it's not going to move forward. It's going to stay here as we tilt the upper body. So the movement is coming from hinging at my right hip or flexing at my right hip. I'm going to keep that feeling of the broom behind my back as I hinge or hover over this right thigh. But the right knee didn't move forward. The right knee stayed where it is. And then we'll lift back up. Keep the glutes active just like we did for that hip hinge. Hover forward so our right hip crease where the right thigh meets the hip is moving back. And we're keeping this feeling of the broom behind our back. Now just like we did to get back up to standing, use your glutes, lift back up. You can keep the hands here at the ribs, or you can try it with the arms up. We're gonna do that same thing, moving from the right hip crease moves back. We're flexing. Our torso is coming toward that right thigh without rounding the back. Use your glutes to get back up. Also working the core. One more time, hover forward. The right knee does not move. The right hip moves. So that right hip crease moves back as the torso hovers over the thigh. Come back up. Lower the hands right under the shoulders. Three-legged quadruped. Right toes come back. Lift the front of the throat. Make sure we're not tipping the pelvis. Lift the pubic bone up. Check in with that neutral shoulder blade. Lift the right leg up any amount. Now you can keep doing what we did in quadruped earlier, flexing and extending the hip. If you'd like to add a little bit more core stability challenge, you're going to reach this left arm forward. Left arm will stay here. We're not going to round the back, but if you'd like, flex. We're not going to round the back. We're just going to hold this triple S, stacking, and flex the right hip any amount. So now it's going to be a little bit harder to flex that right hip, getting the torso toward the thigh with our left hand off the ground, and then we'll extend it back out. So if you find that you're compensating your posture by having this left arm up, bring it back down. We're going to do that 3 more times. Flex the right hip, thigh toward the torso without anything else changing. Extend it back out. Thigh toward the torso, flex that right hip. Extend it out. Bring that right thigh to the torso, flexing the right hip, hold that neutral pelvis, extend it back out, release it to quadruped. Left foot steps through, right toes can be tucked or untucked. Lift up, now check that neutral pelvis, zipper that pubic bone up, hands will come to front and back of the ribs to start. Keep the glutes active. Now again, our left knee is not going to move forward. Our left hip crease will move backwards so that we can flex. So the movement is coming from that left hip. Hovering the torso toward that left thigh. Left hip crease where the left thigh meets the hip moves back. And then we'll use the glutes to get back up. So really press into that left foot. Hover forward, flexing or hinging at this left hip. Press into the feet, use your glutes, get back up. Keep the hands here or reach your arms up. Keep that feeling of the broom behind your back. Hover, flexing at this left hip, torso toward the thigh. Lift the belly. Come back up. One more, hold everything in this triple S alignment and hinge at that left hip. Coming back up. Lower the hands, heading to three-legged quadruped. Left leg extends back. Shoulders over your wrist creases. Find that neutral neck. Lift the front of the throat. Draw those pelvic points in. Stick with this, or the right arm can reach forward, but we're not going to round the back. We're going to keep this feeling of the broom behind our back as we flex the left hip, bringing the left thigh toward the torso any amount. Extending it back out. Don't let any movement happen in the shoulder blades or the pelvis. Flex the left hip, thigh toward the torso. You can always lower this right hand down. Extend it out. Lift the throat. Flex the left hip, thigh toward the torso. Extend it back out. Press evenly into both hands. If both hands are down, flex the left hip, lift the throat. Extend it back out. Release it down. Head to downward dog, keeping the torso toward the thigh as much as possible, shortening the stance. If you'd rather skip downward dog, you can take child's pose or cat-cow. Think about that hip flexion here. Torso toward the thigh, thigh toward the torso. Lifting the pubic bone up toward the belly button and drawing those pelvic points in. If you can, continue to think about the torso toward the thigh as you bend your knees, walk forward. Hinge at your hips, just like that happy squat. Now we're at the front of the mat. Triple flexion in the ankles, knees, and hips. Think about that broom behind your back as you rise to stand. Arms reach forward and up. Exhale, release the hands down. We're going to do some of that hip flexion standing now. We'll start with our arms in front of us. Palms are forward, wrists are in extension. So we're almost just in a plank, but standing upright. So set it up so that your shoulders would be right over your wrist crease if we tipped over and we're on the floor in plank. So it's that same feeling here, feeling that broom behind the back. Neutral scapula, so they're not protracting, they're not puffing up, they're not retracting, squeezing in, and we're gonna hold that pelvic bowl upright and not let it move. So this is a great way to just think about your plank alignment. We're gonna hold this and pick up one foot at a time, doesn't have to come very high, but it's that flexion, that action of bringing the thigh toward the torso. Step it down without anything else moving. Left hip will flex. Pick it up any amount, thigh to the torso, and then lower it down. So as you're doing this, you're gonna alternate, just like we did on the ground before bridge pose, thinking about the hip creases without anything changing in the head, the upper back, the pelvis. So nothing moves, just the hips. We're holding really strong and stable, as if we were in a plank right now. We've done this in quadruped, very similar. Lower both feet down, release your arms. You can roll the shoulders, maybe the wrists, shake out anything else that needs to move. Heading into a high lunge or crescent lunge. Keep your two pelvic points right at the front of your pelvis, facing forward, and we'll step this right foot back. It doesn't have to be very far. Stepping onto the ball of that right foot, we'll bend both knees, so that again, we're not tipping the pelvis. We have that neutral pelvis, which will be much easier to flex the hips. Think about that stacking of the head over the shoulders, over the pelvis. You can keep your hands somewhere on the body. They can be at the sides of the pelvis, near the hip creases, front and back of the pelvis, maybe front and back of the ribs if that's where you need a little bit of extra feedback. We're gonna load our left foot, so press your weight into that left foot. And we'll start to unweight this right foot, tapping the ball of the right foot forward. Now the pelvis stays neutral, this left glute is squeezing. We're gonna flex this right hip by lifting up a little bit more, thigh toward the torso, without anything in your posture changing. Tap it back down. Hold that neutral pelvis, step it back to your lunge, bending both knees. Load that left foot, get ready to step on it. Unweight the right foot, tap it forward, squeeze that left glute. Lift the thigh toward the torso, flexing that right hip. Tap it down. Step back for your lunge, holding this neutral pelvis. Tap it forward. Squeeze that left glute. Flex the right hip. Tap it down. We're going to step our right foot back and turn to the side of the mat. Parallel the feet for side lunges. Now, as we side lunge, there's so much we can think about. Just like downward dog today, I want you to think about the thigh coming toward the torso as we hinge or flex this right hip. So it's just a different way to do that same movement, torso to the thigh, without changing the spine or the pelvis. So we're gonna keep that feeling of the broom behind our back. Side lunge to the left. So now the left hip is flexing, left hip crease moves back, torso toward the thigh. Side lunge to the right. Hold that neutral pelvis. Draw those pelvic points in. Side lunge to the left. Make sure you're not tipping the pelvis forward. Lift the pubic bone to the belly. Stand up. Step it back to the top of your mat. On the other side, starting with that high lunge, check that feeling of the broom behind your back. Hold that as you step the ball of the left foot back. High lunge. Bend both knees. Zipper the pubic bone up toward the belly so that we're not tipping forward. Hands can come wherever it's helpful for that brain-body connection. We're gonna load our right foot, so really get ready to put your weight into that right foot as we tap the left foot forward. Squeeze that right glute, flex the left hip, left thigh toward the torso. Tap it back down. Hold everything really still and really strong as you step it back to your lunge. Zipper that pubic bone up. Tap the left foot forward, flex the left hip, tap it back down, hold strong as you step the ball of the left foot back, high lunge, Tap it forward. Squeeze that right glute. Flex the left hip thigh toward the torso. Tap it down. Step the left foot back. Turn toward the side of your mat. Hands can be anywhere for those side lunges. Flex the left hip. So now our left hip crease is moving back. Our torso is hovering near this left thigh, but we're not collapsing anywhere. We're keeping that stacking of the triple S. Bend into that right knee. Side lunge to the right. Flex that right hip. Feel the thigh toward the torso. Side lunge to the left. Lift the pubic bone to the belly. Side lunge to the right. Draw those pelvic points in. Lift the front of the throat up toward the ceiling. Come back to standing. Step it back to the top of your mat. We're going to work on one more way to get some active hip flexion. We're going to start in our hip hinge, kind of like a chair pose. Feet can be as far apart as you'd like. Fingertips will come to the hip creases again. Send those hips back. So the knees bend, but only because the hips move back, and we don't want to have straight legs necessarily when we do that. But the movement isn't coming from the knees bending. So the hips move back, and the knees will naturally bend as you hinge. So we don't want the focus to be in the knees. We want the hips to do the moving without collapsing that spine. Knees over the ankles, pelvis is neutral. Now, if this feels like a lot to focus on, stick with this. We want to be able to press into the heels and the big toes here. So if you really feel like you're moving back, press those big toe mounds down. You can hold here, or we'll start by lifting this right heel without anything changing. So notice if the pelvis or the back changed. Maybe slide those right toes back without moving this left hip, keeping that left hip in that hinge or flexion. And then come back to that hip hinge. Put both feet down. Recheck that feeling of the broom behind your back. Maybe we lift the left heel. Stick with this, or slide these left toes back without your right hip moving, so that right hip stays in that flexed position, belly toward the thigh. And then back to that hip hinge. Lift the right heel. Maybe slide it back. Now it can slide back a few inches. You don't need to slide that right leg all the way back. We want to focus on this left hip and left glute working. Back to that hip hinge, one more. Maybe we lift the left heel, hold that right hip where it is. Maybe we slide the left foot back. Back to that hip hinge. Check that feeling of the broom behind your back, lifting the pubic bone up. Press into the feet, rise to stand. Coming onto our backs, we're going to do a little stretch. Find that triple S. We'll have both knees bent, feet on the mat. Feel the sacrum right above the tailbone on the mat. The shoulder blades are the scapula and the back of the skull. As much as you can, try to get the chin toward the throat so we've got that neutral neck. We're going to flex the right hip, so you can not use your hands at first, and just flex the right hip, keeping the sacrum down. So we're just trying to bring the thigh toward the torso without lifting that low back up, so hold that sacrum down. Now we'll turn it into a passive stretch by grabbing onto that right leg. Maybe it's the shin, the knee, wherever you can grab, and we'll make it passive by encouraging with the weight of our hands that right thigh toward the torso. If this feels like a good stretch, stick with this. If you want to start sliding this left leg out, straightening it to whatever degree feels good for that left hip, you can do that. But again, hold that triple S in place. So we want to learn to move the hips without needing to compensate by moving anything else in the spine. So really moving the hips independently of the pelvis, of the back, upper back, head. If you extended that left leg out, bring the left foot back up, release the right foot down, recheck that triple S, hold the sacrum down, pick up the left foot, and without using the hands at first, flex that left hip to whatever degree it naturally flexes. However far the thigh comes toward the torso without anything else changing. And then we'll grab on, ease our way into that hip flexion for the left hip, thigh toward the torso, torso toward the thigh, keeping the scapula, the sacrum, and the back of the skull down. If it feels good for that right hip, you can start to straighten that right leg out to whatever degree feels good. So if you're in that position, the right hip is extending a little bit and the left hip is flexing. The sacrum is down. Bring that right foot back to the mat, then the left foot. Pick up your right foot and flex it. Cross it over your left thigh. Stay here if that feels good, making sure the sacrum is down, drawing those pelvic points in, or you can flex your left hip here. Pick up the left foot off the ground, and any amount. The more that left thigh comes toward the torso, the more that left hip is flexing, which will deepen the stretch in the outer right hip. Hands can come to that goalpost shape if that feels good. Or take your right hand and you can ease that right knee away from the body, helping to externally rotate that right hip a little bit more. Release it down. We'll switch sides. Flex the left foot, cross it over your right thigh. Make sure the sacrum is down, drawing those pelvic points in. Stay here or pick up the right foot, flexing that right hip, bringing the right thigh toward the torso. You can goalpost the arms or take that left hand and ease that left knee away from the body a little bit, which will go a little bit further into that left hip stretch. Release it down. Make your way into whatever Shavasana feels good. Let your eyes close. Feel the back of the skull on the mat, the shoulder blades, and the sacrum right above the tailbone. Allow your body to relax. Come back to whatever your natural breath is. Take a moment to check in, mind, body, and spirit. Thanking yourself for your practice today. Allowing yourself to stay here as long as you'd like.